Okay, class, I promise this won't become a habit, but there's a handful of slides that we didn't get to at the end of today, and next week is a really, really, really important week. I cannot stress how important it is. We are going to cover neural signaling, and that is something you must understand. It's fundamental to the rest of everything we're going to talk about. If you don't understand how electrical and chemical signaling works, then the rest of it's going to be kind of meaningless. So I want to start out fresh on Tuesday morning with neural signaling. So we are going to knock out these handful of slides via our Moodle webcast, and we'll be good to go for the weekend. All right, you'll be able to do all your review points. Everybody will be caught up, and we will be good. So when we left off, we were at this slide here, the structure of a neuron, and I had already mentioned that neurons all have similar components, but those components may be specialized depending on what the neuron is used for. So here we have a motor neuron, and I'm going to point out the common components. All right, so first we have dendrites. Dendrites represent the input. So each of these components has a job that it does. The job of dendrites is receiving input into a neuron. Next we have the soma, or the cell body, which you can see there, right here. And you notice that all the dendrites funnel into the soma. The soma's job is to make a decision. So it makes its decision based on the input from the dendrites. After the soma begins the output, which is the axon. Now, where the axon connects to the soma is called the axon hillock. And this is a very important junction, because this is where electrical signaling starts to become different. And I'll talk more about that next week, but just know the axon hillock's important. It's really the decision-making point there of yes or no to send an output down the axon. Hey, the axon, we were just talking about the axon. Here's the axon from the soma all the way down to whatever the target is. Now, you'll notice what's around the axon. That myelin. In this case, we see those Schwann cells, which are wrapping individually around segments of the axon. And what does myelin do? Yes, that's right. It provides insulation, just like the insulation on your speaker wire, so that the electrical signal can be efficiently carried to its target. Just talked about the myelin sheath. That's the glial cell providing insulation. Remember, oligodendrocytes, those are the myelin that are found in the central nervous system. Schwann cells, like we see here, are in the peripheral nervous system. And then finally, we have our axon terminal, which is the output. So remember, we talked about electrical signaling happens within a neuron. Chemical signaling happens between neurons. So the dendrites are receiving chemical signals in the means of neurotransmitters, typically, or hormones, converting that chemical signal into an electrical signal that travels all the way down to the axon terminal, where we now have to go from an electrical signal back to the release of neurotransmitter, which is a chemical signal. Finally, we have the synapse. It's not really part of a neuron, but this is the very narrow gap junction between the neuron and its target. So those are the basic parts. Every neuron has dendrites, soma, axon, axon terminal. 4 parts, common components. Okay? I say every neuron. There's always exceptions to the rule. Not every neuron has that, but almost all neurons have that. But neurons are specialized as well. So here we see our motor neuron compared to our sensory neuron. Now, if you remember when we talked about the spinal cord, we talked about the dorsal root ganglia. And the dorsal root ganglia contained all of the soma, or the cell bodies, of the incoming sensory neurons. So here we see our sensory neuron. Maybe this is the skin on your hand. It's receiving an input, sending that electrical signal along, and we want to bypass the soma, because what's the job of the soma? to make a decision. We don't want a sensory neuron to make a decision about whether or not it should send information to the brain. It's more like a wire. So we marginalize the soma in that dorsal root ganglia and pass it on along to its output. All right, I think I said that backwards. So obviously we see here's the skin on this side, and it's going in this direction. You get the point, okay? So if you look at a sensory neuron structure, you would say, wow, this neuron's really not concerned with making decisions because look at the position of its soma. All right, so here are two other types of neurons. Here we have a unipolar neuron. That's what we would call a somatosensory neuron, where the soma is really not making a decision. Here we have a bipolar neuron. We have basically an input and an output, and the soma is making the decision there. So it's going from one side to another. So there's lots of different types of neurons, but they all share these same properties and components. Let's look at some more. Here we see a pyramidal cell. Pyramidal cell is called a pyramidal cell because the shape of the soma is a pyramid, because it's often receiving inputs from multiple different places coming into the soma. Pyramidal cells usually have one long axon. They're also sometimes called projection neurons because they're often projecting from one place in the brain to another place in the brain. So the corpus callosum, we said, is a collection of axons, of connections between the left and the right hemisphere. Projection neurons, like these pyramidal neurons, are the ones sending their axons through the corpus callosum to connect those two sides of the brain. So we can look at this and say, okay, this neuron's getting input from multiple different places, making a decision, and then sending it somewhere, maybe far away. In the cerebellum, this is the Purkinje cell that we talked about. Here we see lots of inputs coming in, a decision and a single output, right? And down here we see our motor neuron that we already talked about. This is a multipolar neuron over here on the right, and here we see a multipolar neuron has lots of different dendrites. It's often called an interneuron, and this is often used for sort of coordinating activity within a local area. So it's not really, doesn't have big axons going places, but rather it's receiving local input and output and helping regulate the activity in a specific area of the brain. All right, so if you understand that dendrites are input, somas are decision making, axons are output, and then axon terminals are the release to a target, you can look at the shape of these different neurons and understand their general function, what their job is. Now, neurons can receive input from either receptors or other neurons. That's typically how neurons, dendrites, get their input. They're either receiving input from another neuron, neurotransmitter, or in the case of sensory neurons, they may be having specialized receptors that they're receiving input from. In terms of targets, there's a lot of different outputs that neurons can have. So we can have a neuron, in the case of a local interneuron, projecting to another neuron, and that's very common, right? We could have a sensory neuron from a receptor projecting to another neuron. In the case of the alpha motor neurons that are going to control our muscle movements, they're receiving input from central nervous system neurons, and their target is muscle fibers. And when they release their neurotransmitters, it causes that muscle fiber to contract. We can also have neurons that release their neurotransmitter into our bloodstream. What happens when we release a chemical into our bloodstream? We call that a hormone. So now we're creating a neurohormone or a neurotransmitter that now gets circulated and has widespread effects throughout the body. So not only can neurons have different shapes and different specializations depending on what their job is, they can also be specialized in terms of where they're getting their input and where they're sending their output. All right, neural signaling. And this is where we're going to leave off for Tuesday. As we mentioned before, electrical signals are important. They carry information within a neuron. They're great because they're fast, and longer distances need faster signals. You have a sensory neuron in your big toe that has its dendrites in the skin of your big toe, and that neuron projects all the way up your leg into your spinal cord with its cell body in the dorsal root ganglia near your lumbar section of your spinal cord and synapses. So you have a neuron that's about 3 feet in length. And so by having an electrical signal sent along that neuron, it's very fast. Okay. There are 2 types of electrical signals that we're going to talk about next week. Synaptic potentials. These are electrical signals at the synapse. These are what are used to process input. And action potentials. And action potentials, you can associate the A with action with the A with axon. These are going to be the electrical outputs that are sent down the axon. Okay. Those outputs are binary, meaning they're on or off. And it's an all or none principle, meaning they can't be bigger, they can't be smaller. It's just on or off, on or off. And then the other signal we talked about was chemical signals. Now, chemical signals are slower, but because the synapses are such small distances, the chemicals don't have to travel very far, so it doesn't really slow down the speed of information that much. The benefit of chemical signaling is that we can be selective and we can now have differential effects. So going back to the autonomic nervous system, when we talked about the sympathetic and the parasympathetic system, same target, the heart. If the sympathetic nervous system releases norepinephrine, because it's a different chemical shape than acetylcholine, acts on a different receptor on the heart, and that receptor causes the heart to speed up. Acetylcholine, coming from the parasympathetic nervous system, acts on a different receptor because of a different shape, and that receptor acts to slow the heart down. So the benefit of neurotransmitters is that we get selective activity in targets. We also can we avoid crosstalk, right? So that if we have multiple neurons releasing chemical signals, those chemical signals have specific effects. Whereas if they were all just releasing electricity, we wouldn't know where the electricity was coming from. All right, here are your review points. Get at it. You've got 5 long days until next Tuesday. Please use them well. Learn those cranial nerves. It will be worth it. There's several songs online on the Moodle post to help you learn the cranial nerves. A couple raps. There's an acoustic version. I really tried to mix up genres for you. Unfortunately, I'm not singing any of them, but maybe another time. All right, I hope you have a great weekend.